Okay, so you've sent in a really fascinating collection of information about navigating the U.S. immigration system, and it seems like you're really interested in focusing on undocumented immigrants and what that whole process is like for people.
Yes, exactly. And I think the use of the word illegal in some of the sources, we're going to assume that that means either illegal or undocumented, just so we're all on the same page.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And we're going to do a really deep dive into all the different aspects of this.
Mm.
So we're looking at, the sources mentioned legal pathways and obviously the challenges faced by those without legal status and any temporary protections that might be out there. And we also saw that there was some practical advice in there as well. So
Right. So the idea is to really kind of pull out the most critical information from what you've provided so that you can get a really clear picture of this very complicated situation.
yes, and one thing I want to emphasize right up front is that we are not lawyers.
Not at all.
We are definitely not giving legal advice. We're just trying to take all these different perspectives that you've sent and synthesize them and just kind of get a clearer understanding for you.
Right.
And again, not endorsing any particular course of action. It's just to provide that understanding of a complex situation.
Exactly.
Okay.
So maybe we can jump right into it. And one of the things that your sources start with is this idea of potential legal pathways to remaining in the United States.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting how nuanced they are in the way they're presenting this information. You know, there's not a sense of false hope given. It's really laying out the specific criteria and the inherent difficulties.
Right.
And maybe we can start with asylum, because that often's seen as this, really critical protection.
Absolutely. And asylum, as explained in the sources, is for people who have a really well-founded fear of persecution if they were to return to their home country.
Right.
And this fear has to be based on, things like race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group.
Yeah, any of those things.
And it's not just, I'm afraid to go back. It has to be
Yeah.
very specific and well-founded.
And I think one thing that the source material really emphasizes is this strict 1-year deadline for applying for asylum once you've entered the U.S.
Right. It's a very short window.
Very short window, especially if you're, dealing with just basic survival needs upon arrival.
Right.
And, as you said, the fear of persecution has to be well-founded, which means that you really carry the burden of proof when you are applying. You have to show that, there's a credible threat.
You need evidence.
You need evidence, exactly. It can't just be a feeling. It has to be something that can be documented or corroborated with very solid testimony. So I think, the takeaway there is that while asylum is a crucial lifeline, there are strict timelines and really difficult evidentiary demands that make it a high-stakes process.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what happens if you're denied asylum?
Well, that's where things can get really tricky, because often if you are denied asylum, it can lead to the initiation of deportation proceedings.
So it's not a step to be taken lightly.
Absolutely not. It's a really big decision.
Yeah, and another pathway that was mentioned is family sponsorship. And this sounds kind of straightforward at first, but it's pretty complicated too.
Yeah, at first glance, you think, oh, well, if I have a relative here, a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, that they can sponsor me for a green card. But it's not that simple.
Right.
And one of the details that the sources really highlight is the prerequisite of legal entry into the U.S.
Right. You have to have come in legally.
You have to have entered legally, which of course poses a significant problem for many undocumented individuals who by definition did not enter legally.
Yeah.
So, it can get very complex. It often requires individuals to leave the U.S. to process their application, which can lead to really lengthy periods of separation.
And you might not get back in.
And the risk of not being allowed back in. So even if you did enter legally, these processes can take, months, if not years. So
Right. So it's not a quick fix, even if you have family members who are citizens. Yeah. And another one that the sources mentioned is employment-based visas. So is that something that's realistic for somebody who's already undocumented?
I think the key factor there is that you would need specialized skills that are in high demand by a U.S. employer.
Right.
And that employer has to be willing to sponsor you for the visa. And as your sources rightly point out, this is a less common pathway for those who are undocumented, because you're asking a lot of the employer.
Right. They have to go to bat for you.
They have to go to bat for you and prove that there aren't qualified U.S. workers available.
Yeah, it's a lot of paperwork.
It's a lot of paperwork.
Yeah. So that one's kind of a long shot.
It is. It can be a long shot. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the U visa. So this is a really specific one.
Yeah, this is very specific, and it's designed for people who have been victims of certain serious crimes, so things like domestic violence, human trafficking, other offenses that are listed. And they have to have cooperated with law enforcement in the investigation or prosecution of that crime.
So you have to have helped law enforcement.
You have to have assisted law enforcement.
Right. And then you can get this temporary status.
Right. And the great thing about the U visa is that it can potentially lead to a green card down the line.
Oh, wow.
So it's a really important protection.
Right.
But again, eligibility really hinges on being a victim of a very specific type of crime and actively assisting law enforcement.
Right.
So it's not, a broad pathway
Right.
for the general undocumented population.
Okay. And then the last one that was mentioned in the sources is cancellation of removal.
Yeah.
That sounds very technical.
It does. It's a little bit of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But essentially, this is something that would be pursued if you're already in deportation proceedings.
Oh, okay. So it's really like a last resort.
It's a last resort, and the requirements are incredibly strict.
What are they?
Well, generally, you need to have resided continuously in the U.S. for at least 10 years. You need to have been a person of good moral character during that time.
Well.
And your deportation would have to cause extreme hardship to a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse, parent, or child.
Extreme hardship? I mean, what does that even mean?
Well, it's difficult to give definitive examples without legal context, but you're talking about a significant level of suffering that would go above and beyond the normal difficulties of separation. So it could be, a U.S. citizen child with severe medical needs who wouldn't be able to receive care in the country of origin, or it could be a U.S. citizen spouse with a debilitating condition who's completely reliant on the undocumented individual for their daily care.
So it's a very high bar.
It's a very high bar. And again, it requires, this lengthy period of continuous presence and a demonstration of exceptional hardship to qualifying relatives. So I think, as we look at this overview of legal pathways, it's clear that they're very specific, they're difficult to access, and they're not guaranteed.
Right.
And pursuing them without proper understanding could lead to negative consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to the next section, which is the challenges of staying in the U.S. without legal status.
Right. And I think, at the forefront of everyone's mind has to be this threat of deportation.
Right. You could just get picked up.
Yeah. And as the sources point out, encounters with immigration authorities can happen anywhere, from targeted raids to even routine traffic stops.
Yeah, you could just get pulled over.
You could get pulled over for a broken taillight and end up in deportation proceedings.
Right. So there's just this constant fear.
It's a huge amount of stress and anxiety.
Yeah, absolutely. And another big thing is access to basic necessities. That becomes really restricted.
Right.
The sources talk about limitations on public benefits.
So no health care, no housing assistance.
And even student aid for education. So it really limits your options in life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then the biggest one for a lot of people is going to be employment.
Yes, because without legal work authorization,
you can't get a normal job.
The jobs you can get are very limited and often, as the sources point out, lead to exploitation.
What do you mean?
Well, because you're undocumented and you don't have that legal protection, you might be more likely to be taken advantage of by an employer. They might pay you less than minimum wage.
Yeah, or make you work in dangerous conditions.
Or even subject you to abuse, knowing that you're less likely to report it because you're afraid of deportation.
Yeah, it's a terrible situation.
It really is, yeah.
And then another thing that came up is the whole visa overstay issue.
Yeah.
Like if you just decide to stay longer than you're supposed to.
Right. And it seems like a simple way to, just extend your time here. But the sources are very clear that this is a violation of immigration law.
Right.
And it can actually trigger bans on being able to re-enter the United States.
So you might not ever be able to come back legally.
Exactly.
Wow.
So, it's a small act that can have huge long-term negative repercussions.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about legal pathways, which are pretty limited, and then the challenges of living here undocumented, which are huge. So then the sources move on to temporary protections. And I think it's important to emphasize that these are not permanent solutions.
Right.
It's not a pathway to citizenship. It's just something temporary.
Exactly.
So the biggest one that everyone's heard about is DACA.
Yeah, DACA.
Deferred action for childhood arrival.
So it's childhood arrivals, right?
So can you explain who's eligible for that?
Well, generally speaking, it applies to individuals who came to the United States as children, and they had to have arrived before a certain age, and they have to meet other specific requirements, like they have to have been living here continuously, and, no serious criminal history.
Right.
But if you get DACA, it means that you get temporary protection from deportation.
Okay.
You're eligible for a work permit.
Okay, so you can get a job.
You can get a legal job, but the really important thing to highlight is that it does not give you a green card.
Right, it's temporary.
It is very temporary, and also, as the sources point out, its legal standing is actually quite uncertain. It's been subject to a lot of legal challenges in recent years.
It could go away at any time.
It could go away at any time.
Yeah.
So it's a temporary relief, but with a lot of uncertainty attached to it.
Right, okay, and then there's another one called Temporary Protected Status, or TPS.
Yeah, TPS. And how is that different from DACA?
Well, TPS is for people from specific countries that are experiencing some kind of really bad situation, like a war or a natural disaster.
Okay, so it's tied to the conditions in their home country,
Exactly.
not to their individual circumstances.
And unless people who are already here from those countries stay here and work legally,
Yeah.
but again, it's temporary.
Right, and it can be terminated if conditions improve
Right.
back in their home country.
So it's not a permanent solution.
Not at all.
Okay, so now we get to the part about the practical steps that people can take, and we have to emphasize that these are not legal advice. These are just things that people can do to kind of help themselves to the extent possible.
Right, yeah, and I think the most basic and most important thing is to just stay informed.
Right, because the laws are always changing.
The laws are constantly changing,
Good.
so checking the USCIS website regularly.
That's UICI.gov.
USS.gov.
Right, keep an eye on it because things can change
Yeah.
at any time.
Right, and another thing is to avoid trouble.
Oh, yeah, big one.
Stay out of trouble because even a minor thing could get you deported,
Absolutely.
like a traffic ticket.
Yeah, if you get pulled over and you don't have a driver's license,
Yeah, you're in big trouble.
that could be it for you. So you really need to stay on the right side of the law.
Yeah, and then document your time.
Okay, what does that mean?
Keep all your records, like utility bills, school records, pay stubs, anything that shows how long you've been here.
Right, because it might be useful down the road.
Exactly. It might help you qualify for something in the future.
It could be a piece of evidence that's really helpful.
Right, so don't throw anything away.
Mhm.
Keep everything.
Yeah, and then the most important one is to get legal help.
Yes.
And this is really important. Talk to a real lawyer,
Yeah, not just anybody.
not just anybody.
An immigration attorney or an accredited representative.
Right, and be careful about scams.
Oh, yeah, because there's so many scams out there.
People who will take your money and then disappear.
Exactly. So make sure you're going to a legitimate source.
Yeah, and actually your sources provided a list of organizations that can help.
Okay, great.
So the first one is the American Immigration Council,
American Immigration Council.
and their website is AmericaImmigrationCouncil.org.
Okay,
And they provide information on immigration laws and policies.
great.
And then the National Immigration Law Center, or NILC,
Okay,
and their website is nillc.org.
millisc.org.
And they advocate for immigrant rights and provide resources.
Okay, great.
And then United We Dream, which is unitedwedream.org.
Okay,
And they support undocumented youth.
okay.
They give them advice and create a sense of community.
Great. So some really good resources there.
Yeah. And of course, the official USCIS website, eca2.gov.
Okay.
That's the government website for immigration information.
All right. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways for you?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that living in the U.S. without legal status is incredibly precarious.
Yeah, it's a very vulnerable position to be in.
Yeah. There's constant uncertainty. You're always afraid.
Absolutely.
You don't have access to a lot of things.
Right. And, you know, there are legal pathways, but they are very difficult to access.
Very difficult.
And the requirements are stringent.
Yeah. You really need to have a lawyer to help you navigate this.
100%. And I think, you know, it's important to reiterate that overstaying a visa or staying here undocumented is not a good long-term strategy.
It's not a good idea.
It's not a good idea, and it actually makes you more vulnerable.
Yeah, you're really putting yourself at risk.
Exactly.
So the message from all these sources is clear. You need to talk to a lawyer.
You need to get expert legal advice.
Yeah, because what might seem like an option could actually backfire.
It could really backfire, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not worth taking that chance.
Absolutely not.
Okay, so I think we've covered everything, and, you know, it's a lot to think about.
It really is, and it makes you think about the system as a whole, you know?
Yeah, the broader implications.
Yeah, your broader implications, right. We've looked at the laws, the pathways, the challenges, but what about the human impact?
Right.
You know, these are real people trying to build lives, and it's so difficult for them.
And it makes you wonder, you know, why is it so hard?
Right. Why is it so hard? And what does that say about our society and our values.
Yeah, it's a question we all need to grapple with.
Absolutely.
So for our listeners out there, I think it's important to really consider this on a human level and think about what we can do to create a more just and compassionate system.
Yeah, because everyone deserves a chance to live a good life,
Absolutely.
regardless of where they're from.
Okay, well, on that note, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.
Bye.